Welcome to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're talking about slut-shaming.
Is that what we're talking about today?
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought we agreed upon this before we started rolling.
We did, but I thought we were going to call it something else.
Oh, what do you want to call it? We'll call it that.
We'll call it slut-shaming, because I was going to say something like oppression of sexual deviant behavior, or our perceptions of others and their behavior as it pertains to our social programming. But all of that sounds awful. I think we should call it slut-shaming.
Yeah.
I think that's the best phrase for this podcast.
So there is this prevailing assumption that the Chinese government, or somebody, is flooding the United States with counterfeit money in order to devalue our currency, right? There's this idea that our currency is under threat of, and it might not be China, it might be other countries printing money and putting it into our, because we're from the United States, so we have this perception in the United States that other countries are messing with our money supply by counterfeiting it, flooding the market in order to drive down the value of the dollar and then make the United States weaker financially, weaker in the world, and elevate themselves. Why do I bring this up?
Is this a conspiracy theory?
I don't know. I've just heard people talk about this, but let's just assume that's, at least a working theory that may or may not be happening. It's a great metaphor for this idea of slut shaming because...
Yeah, why is that a good metaphor for slut shaming? That's a great question.
So first of all, let's define what slut shaming is, right? So it's this idea that, and I think it's mostly in the context of females, women, who are made to feel like...
it's rare for men to be slut shamed.
Yeah, it's like women are made to feel like if they are open sexually, sensually, with their bodies, with how they dress, with who they...
Their concepts or beliefs around birth control.
All sorts of stuff, right? And not just the United States, but all sorts of countries have different social rules about this. They're made to feel, in often most developed countries, women who are promiscuous or open with their sexuality can sometimes be made to feel like they're wrong, they're bad, they're making choices that are just really dirty and terrible. And the word that's often attributed to women who, are more open than maybe other women are, you're a slut. You're dirty, you're a whore, you're a slut, you're filthy, blah, 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 blah. This kind of language, right?
Right. Well, and I think one of the reasons why we're talking about it tonight, or today, or on this podcast, it happens to be nighttime that we're recording this podcast, by the way. One of the reasons why we're talking about it on this podcast is I'm really disturbed by it.
Yeah.
It's something that's been on my mind lately. I've been talking about it and with you, and it's something that in general just kind of feels really icky to me. I think that this concept of slut shaming is very indicative of I would say that my guess is that it's, when we were talking about before, is that it's part of the fear that others might have of women gaining some real sexual power.
Sure.
However...
But what's weird about it?
Yeah.
Is it's not men. I mean, there are men that call women sluts, don't get me wrong. But I've noticed this pattern of women calling other women sluts or whores or sexual deviants or whatever when they're more loose or more open with their sexuality.
Right. Well, and that's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that our observation is that slut shaming happens way more between women than it does between men and women. Now, there is slut shaming that happens from men to women, for sure. That definitely happens.
But today, let's just talk about the women to women stuff.
Well, I mean, I'd like to address both, but
sure.
I find it really interesting that there is a huge population of women who will slut shame other women. And this goes back to your illustration of counterfeit money.
Yeah. So I've got this thought that I think what's happening, and I don't know this to be true, but this is speculation. I've talked to other people about this, and I think that this is probably what's somewhat going on, is there is a sense of women feel a value in their sexuality as almost like a currency. And that's why I use the illustration of currency, is this value they can offer to the world, their sexuality, whether they're bi or straight, it doesn't matter, or homosexual, bi, straight, lesbian, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're offering a value to the world, which is their sexuality. And I think there's this kind of like unspoken rule, and you tell me, you're a woman, you might have more sense of this than I do, that if one of the women in the world or multiple women begin to give away this currency, which is their sexuality, this thing they hold, in a casual way, it devalues the power or the value of that for everyone else. It's kind of like flooding the market, like I used the illustration early, with counterfeit currency. So if you see your sexuality, if you're a woman and you see your sexuality as a currency, you know, something that you offer is valuable, and other women are giving it away for free, well, now that devalues what you might be able to trade or engage in a transactional way with whoever you'd like to trade or engage transactionally with.
Right, like the whole old, the old saying, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free?
Sure.
So it potentially endangers or threatens another woman's ability to, say, land a husband.
Sure, yeah.
If there are other women out there willing to have sex without any attachment, and he's, you know, he has the ability to just go have sex.
Why would he marry me when all these other women are readily available on various nights of the week?
Right.
For his pleasure and enjoyment, why would I get this guy in my life? And, you know, why would he want to be with me?
Right. What's really interesting is that the anger doesn't get placed on the man necessarily, because I think it's because there's this idea that he's just doing what's natural to men. The anger gets put on the other woman, and I think it's because of this thought that she should know better. Yeah. She should understand how this currency works.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating. I find it really interesting when women slut shame other women. And what's fascinating, I think, too, about this is I don't think it just comes back to belief structures. I don't think it's just, you know, say, take, for example...
You mean like a Judeo-Christian?
Yeah, exactly. Like a religious concept that it's wrong to have sex before marriage, and this person is, you know, this woman is having sex before marriage. For people that are just coming from that sort of perspective or paradigm, they don't do a lot of shaming, right? They say it's wrong for the man and it's wrong for the woman to have sex before marriage, and they just leave it at that. The visceral anger that surfaces, though, like that piece of like the sort of the twisted mouth, twisted face stereotype of the person who is calling this woman who doesn't meet their moral or ethical criteria for how sexuality should be expressed, when they call that person a slut or a whore, I don't think that has anything to do with belief. I think it has everything to do with what you're talking about. This concept that this person is now flooding the market, right? And devaluing their stock, right?
Yeah.
By not making it as special.
Yeah. I think, and just so I want to be clear again, I think I'm the one that always kind of clarifies this, and I'm not sure why I always do, but I do. We're talking in some generalities and some like overarching concepts. Please don't think that we think that this is what reality is in any sense of the word. This is speculative conversation, and that we're just kind of, we're riffing a little bit here on this topic.
Yeah.
And I know it's a subject, gender equality, gender differences, feminism, masculine, you know, trait. All these things are very hot button issues on certain topics. So we're not trying to incite any kind of like disagreement or discord here. We're making an observation around some things we've observed. I just want to make that clear so we don't get angry emails, that's all.
Well, I mean, if we do get angry emails...
I don't mind them. I just want people to understand that our heart's good, and we're trying to have a great conversation about this idea.
Yeah.
And we're talking generalities just so it can facilitate great conversation, not because we want to pigeonhole anyone. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, definitely not. And the really sad thing about slut shaming as well is that it's not just reserved for people who have a more, or women who have a more open sexual experience or mentality. Unfortunately, you see slut shaming happen for women who maybe want to, you know, go get birth control.
Yeah.
Or, you know, women who have been raped. there have been historically women have tons of slut shaming that happen when they've been raped, when they've been a victim of a situation that they didn't ask for. What's interesting is that we were talking about before, we wonder if actually slut shaming that happens with rape victims might be actually more men, that the men are more likely to slut shame in a situation of rape than women, fellow women are. I think fellow women are a little bit, as a rule, more sympathetic to that idea, because there's this sort of like, it doesn't matter how petty of a woman you are. There's a sisterhood mentality of like, rape is bad.
Yeah.
Like none of us want to be raped. And if somebody else gets raped, it's got to take somebody who's pretty detached and has dehumanized the rape victim to not go, yeah, that sucks.
Yeah.
However, I think the slut shaming that happens with rape victims has a tendency to more likely be men that do the slut shaming because of what you mentioned before, this concept of damaged goods.
Yeah.
Which is very sad in and of itself, and I don't think anybody that I know of thinks that's okay, right?
Yeah, no.
And so
but I've seen guys have that kind of mentality, like,
yeah,
a woman is damaged or she's no good if she's used up or been raped or assaulted, or even she's had a lot of sexual partners or whatever. They kind of see her in kind of this bad way when that's not reality, in my opinion. But there's dudes that think that. There's guys that think that in that kind of way, which is kind of icky to me.
So for me, it's always about etymology, right? Like, where does this come from? Like, what's the root source of this? Why would people feel like it's necessary to create shame around something like sexuality? So we've been talking a lot about this idea of controlling sexuality. Over the years, we have a lot of perspectives, paradigms, and religions that have dictated how sexuality should be used.
Yeah.
And since you and I are both, fans of evolutionary psychology, it's really interesting to observe at what point in our history this control really started surfacing. And it seems like this started surfacing around the time that civilizations were being designed, right? Even unconsciously designed. Sort of the architecture of civilization also happens to, create a certain amount of socialization. And that socialization always gets attached to this idea of sexuality. Like how sexuality is supposed to be expressed. One of my favorite writers is Robert Anton Wilson, who wrote a book called Prometheus Rising. And one of the things he mentions about sexuality is that the only rule that we have about sex is that there's going to be rules about sex.
Yeah.
That's the only actual rule. The only real rule about sex is that we're going to have rules. One of the reasons why is because procreation is one of the fundamental things that we do as humans, right? Like as people, we're basically sort of cargo or canisters for little genetic scripts that we pass from us to our young. And we are the living hosts of these scripts that we got passed on, that got passed on to us from our parents. And really it feels like this desire to live that all species has, ultimately culminates in passing this genetic script to the next generation. So you could almost say it's the genetic script that wants to live.
Yeah.
Right? And we feel like when we have children, it's like, okay, there's a little bit of immortality there. You'll even hear people say that in very poetic terms. There's a little bit of immortality in having a child. Yes and no, right? Like they got our script, they got our DNA, they got our genetic script. Like they're little hosts for our genetic script, which is not really ours. We inherited it as well. So because that is such a fundamental part of being human, such a fundamental part of wanting to live, one of the first things that we did as people is we started creating rules around them. Who can pass on their genetic script? What context can they pass that genetic script on? Like, it's all about who's allowed to, what is the context in which they're allowed to. And you can really see why marriage started to surface when it wasn't just a matter of genetic script. It was now also a matter of possessions.
Yeah, like property. You have a big mansion, or you've got a little piece of ground, a scratch in the ground that you want to pass on. You own this. Well, who are you going to pass it on to? You want to pass it on to your children. People that will carry on your genetic script so they have resource to be able to carry it on even further.
Right, because you're still trying to get that genetic script to be able to live, right? Like you're trying to give your little genetic script the best shot it can. So you start that genetic script, and the host for that genetic script, i.e. your children, you start them out in the best circumstances possible, which are resources.
Yeah.
Right? Like when we're born into resource, our life is 1,000 times better and way easier, and we live much longer, and we are more likely to pass our DNA on if we have that abundant resource, or at least a portion of resource. It doesn't even have to be abundant. The more resource we have as humans, the better our shots. And so you could see why people would want to pass their resource onto their DNA, to their genetic script, giving that script the best shot possible. So how do you know if a woman is carrying your young? How do you know? Right? Like, what's your guarantee that she is carrying your code?
Maury Povich.
Yeah. Yes, we have a major, major advantage in this day and age for knowing who's carrying our DNA.
For those outside the United States, there is a daytime television host who makes his living. This is Maury Povich, right? I'm not mistaken.
That's Maury. Yep.
I don't actually watch this, so I might be inaccurate on some of the details. But anyway, this person in the United States has a show during daytime television where they bring on women who have had babies, and the men they have had sex with.
And who are ostensibly raising these children at this point.
Yeah, and they do genetic testing to see if these men who are raising these children are actually the father of these children.
Oh, it's very dramatic.
And they reveal it on the... I've seen this a couple times, and it's terribly horrifying. They reveal it on the show, and drama ensues, and chairs are thrown, and people are punched, and screaming happens, and then there's a commercial break,
right?
And then they start the whole thing over again on the next section. But so anyway, I just wanted to. People in Australia and England are like, "What are you talking about?" Just make sure you guys are, or other countries might be like, "What in the world?"
I like the idea that Maury is international. I like the idea that everybody knows who Maury Povich is.
Oh God, no, please!
Because I want to share the pain.
It's horrifying. Just Google or look it up on YouTube. You'll be horrified.
Or don't if you want a pleasant evening.
It's horrifying.
Right. So all of that said, that tangent, and actually I want to put a bookmark there because I'm going to come back to Maury. I got more to say on Maury. But that said, throughout the ages pre-DNA testing, how did you know if if a woman was carrying your young? And apparently, according to evolutionary psychology, women have been cuckolding men forever. Right? Like even now, some insane statistic like 20% of men are raising children that are not theirs and they don't know that.
Yeah.
Right? Like there was some insane statistic like that, right? 20%, that's 1 in 5. That's a ridiculous number. So...
By the way, can I just tangent for a second? Just to get a quick little side note. I think there is a theory that the reason that happens is because some women like the idea of having a man who's a protector and like a real family man. Mm-hmm. But they also like the idea of having someone who's got great genetics. And oftentimes the genetics are indicated by the bad boy, the motorcycle riding, swagger, John Wayne.
Physical strength
and kind of the...
confidence.
Yeah, but kind of an a-hole sometimes too. But so she'll go sleep with that guy and have his baby, but have the nice guy that stays at home and is protective raise her kids, because then she can have best of both worlds.
Best of both worlds, absolutely. And
that's the theory of why this might happen.
Yeah,
or a theory
that may paint women in a bad light, but that's sort of the yin to the male, to men wanting to have as many children with as many women as possible. Yang. So
they're sleeping with as many women as they can each night.
Right.
Going for
Right, like our lizard brain. Right? Or a mammalian brain, like the parts of us that are real deep inside of, like the earliest, like absolute first iterations of our, our not even conscious minds yet, right? Like that's the part of us that wants to do this kind of crap, right? Like that's the part of us. So women who treat men like cuckolds are the equivalent to men who sleep around, right? And want to impregnate as many women as possible. It's that's kind of how we do it. Those are the strategies that early men and early women Like, those are the things they did in order to survive. So it's kind of hard to judge them, and it's kind of hard to judge ourselves for having these impulses because that's where we came from. That's our etymology. It's understandable. However, we also, at this point, have developed more than just a lizard brain and more than just a mammalian brain. We actually have a neocortex, which gives us the ability to have conscious thoughts and to suppress our impulses.
Sure.
Make choices that are far more sustainable. Like, take, for example, not cuckolding, making a man a cuckold, or not sleeping around with just any skirt because that's your impulse. So we have evolved, which is nice.
Yeah.
That said, it's understandable that we have these impulses. So
20%. I derailed you. Go back to that.
Yeah, 20%, which is an insane, ridiculous number, right? But there's a concept that might be the case. So all of that said, because there is a tendency for people to still see each other, especially the sexes, right? The war of the sexes, the genders, has us still seeing each other in sort of these very archaic ways from the way that we used to be, ridiculous amounts of time ago. There's still a part of us that like fears that. And that makes sense because we were there for a very long time, and we might not have quite evolved to get that programming outside of our brains yet. I believe we're on our way, but we're not quite there. And so understandably, there's this idea of how do we control this? How do we control this situation to make sure that my resource gets passed on to my child? And by we, I mean men, right? Like, men have asked for a long time, how do I make sure that my woman is
raising my children,
raising my children, and when I pass my resources on to these children, that's going to be my genetic script, which wants to live. And one of the best ways to do that is to have sex with a virgin, right? There's no question then, right? There's no question. She can't get impregnated by anybody else because, right? There's no seed inside there. There's no possible seed inside her, except for yours. So you can see where this concept of I want a virgin came from. It's actually quite understandable. It's very understandable. And then all the laws that got made around sexuality, right? Like every law that we see now, whether it's an official governmental political law or whether or not it's a social law, right? An unspoken social contract we create, all sexuality is basically an emergent of this idea of how do we make sure that we are, passing our genetic script onto the best person possible, that we're passing our resources onto our own DNA, etc.
Yeah.
Totally understandable, right?
Yeah.
The difference is, right? And of course, I mean, I'm not even addressing like things like, way back when priests were not allowed to have sex with anybody or to marry because, the church wanted to absorb all of their land and property when they died, right? Like, there's a lot of laws that have nothing to do with genes and have everything to do with, like, people's current state of greed at the time, and they make a law that gets passed down for thousands of years. Or say, a law that happens because some person who was a litigator or a creator of laws, decided something made sense to them at one time, and then we've just sort of inherited it. So there's definitely a lot of those sexual laws as well. But let's talk about just the ones that are around the concept of a virgin, because we're talking fundamentally about slut-shaming, right? And a woman who is not a virgin, or a woman who could maybe possibly be not a virgin, or is thinking unvirgin thoughts or whatever. We can see why there would be an etymology of this. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? And it makes sense to a point where it's kind of like, oh, well, maybe we should slut shame, right?
Well, and it's the as you're talking, the thing that sticks out to me is that we, at least in the Western culture, have really done this with women, but we haven't done it with men as much. Men don't get accused of being a slut, or actually, it's kind of a badge of honor if a guy is sleeping with a lot of women. He's considered a player. Like, oh yeah, you're a player. Hey, it's a good thing. Like, buddies give him high fives in the locker room. It's like this idea that it's like a good old boys club, and conquest is happening and all this. But if women are doing the same thing, it's like, oh my God. And not only men are disturbed by it, but like what we're talking about, women are coming at them and being really on top of it. So it's really, I think it's gender skewed. Women have a much harder time of this than guys do. Right. From my perspective.
Yeah, and that also kind of makes sense too, because women are far more likely to want to create relationships, and that's in part because they, once they're pregnant, they're pretty vulnerable while pregnant, and then they're pretty vulnerable while they're raising their young. So it makes sense that men would be, more in possession of resource that a woman would rely upon. When you are pregnant and when you have young, it's very difficult to also be focusing your attention on gaining resource, right? Like, it's a split attention. It's difficult. And in the days before, birth control
and child care and all these other things.
And child care and all this other stuff, it makes sense that men would be more in possession of resource. So the power would skew that direction, and his ability to make the choice of where his resource goes, it makes sense that it would fall more on the man's lap than it would in the women's, who are looking to be taken care of during that time period. I feel like there's a knee-jerk response that both men and women, but in particular women, might have to these concepts. However, I don't see how it plays out really any other way, truly. It's like, yeah, women are vulnerable when they're pregnant. They're vulnerable when they have young. Men, the resource skew is going to go towards men who have more time freed up to gather it and gain it. And because we all want our genetic script to live on, the only question in our minds is who is the father, because the mom is real clear, right? Like, it's not like it's like, oh, here's a baby.
Do you have kids out there somewhere you don't know about?
Yeah, exactly, right. Like, if I say that, like, well, I don't have any other children, it's like, oh, that you know of, right? So, obviously, like, there's going to be some skewing just because of the biological element of it.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that women can't gain resource at this time period in history. It's not to say that, women are going to turn men into a cuckold. And it's not to say that men are necessarily going to be quote unquote players. It's just, this is the etymology of all this. This is sort of the birthplace of how all this kind of came to be. And now, and I think this is the important point.
So we're recording this in 2014. So right. Now,
the rules of the game have changed dramatically. But the programming is still from then.
So our technology has outpaced our programming, our mental programming.
Right. Like, our technological evolution and our social evolution has outpaced our psychological evolution.
So we have things like condoms and the pill and
DNA testing
and different ways of managing how we pass property from one to another.
Yeah.
And how we hold resource and finances and all these things. Much different than they were 100, 200,000 years ago.
Exactly. So the old rules, I get it, right? They're in a very different time. They're in a time period where there's no certainty around it. And the choice is, am I gonna have sex? Because once you have sex, you're rolling the dice at that point. Whether or not you live, through childbirth, whether or not you get pregnant, right? Like, that's rolling the dice.
Get an STD.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, there's all these up in the air sort of, well, we'll see what fate hands us. At this point, we have so much more choice through the entire process, right? Like, the choice to have sex with somebody, you just, you wear a condom. Right, you wrap it up, and that alters the nature of the game. Yeah. And then after that, whether or not that person, that child is yours, you get DNA testing to find out if that child is yours. So, and at this point, because there is a possibility, or there's the ability to have sex without necessarily getting pregnant, you have women gaining so much more resource at this point because they have time, and even if they have children, the labor is so much smoother. They're far less likely to die. They're a lot less likely to have their children die, so they're not dealing with the emotional anguish of 50% of their babies dying, right?
Women are having fewer children, typically.
Having fewer children, and they're having them later in life. I mean, just like one change in the system would dramatically, alter its emergence. Like 10 changes makes it a totally different landscape. And so this idea of slut-shaming, which is based on old programming. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating that we hold so tight to it in a time period where the concepts are basically obsolete.
This reminds me, so there's a couple things I wanted to say about this. This reminds me of a previous podcast we did on What the Thinker Thinks Approve Approves. Mm-hmm. This idea that, what we believe is true in our mind the prover part of us, the part of us that will prove that out in the real world or find evidence for it, is very real, and will go to work almost dutifully just to prove whatever we believe. And it's interesting to think that this idea that this is a theory that that we've talked about, that the reason we have like moral laws around sexuality are for very practical reasons of lineage and possession and passing resource. Let's say that theory is correct, it got codified into a moral law at some point, where it became a morality rather than just a function of like passing resource down.
Right. And
so now it's part of our morality, our moral, or at least inherited moral fabric of our ancestry, or the generations before us. And oftentimes we just take it as gospel truth because that's just how it is. It's just like this idea that, well, that's right or this is wrong, when the etymology of it, like you're talking about, might have been very practically based.
Yeah.
Based on a current set of social and physical technologies.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and what's fascinating about that is that, I do think a lot of this got co-opted into morality. Again, though, I don't see it as people who take the concept of, say, keeping yourself for your marriage. I don't see those people as necessarily being the worst at slut-shaming. Sometimes it's women who have no problem. And if we're talking specifically about women who slut-shame other women, sometimes those women are open to sex before marriage themselves. It's not about morality. What's fascinating is even with this, like we always assume it's about morality, right? We always assume it's about people who, don't believe in sex before marriage. Those are the people who slut shame. And my observation has been that that's not necessarily the case. I do believe all of those logistical, biological, considerations did get co-opted into morality. And sometimes that does create some snarling as an emergent, right? Like people get really upset with this idea that you could have a different morality than theirs. However, the people who I observe slut shaming sometimes don't have that morality at all themselves. But like you said, they have this idea that their stock is going down, like the currency is being flooded. And that is also based on old programming, right? Like this idea that that's what women have to offer is them being able to be hosts for other people's genetic script.
Yeah.
It goes back to the same thing, right? Like it goes back to the same etymology of how do we engage with each other? We engage with each other as potential carriers of our DNA, which is really what this entire life is about.
Women have way more to offer than sexuality. I mean, women have everything to offer besides sexuality. I mean, sexuality is one thing that all of us humans have, and it's not limited to that. It's kind of what you're saying. I mean, it's like this idea that to think of that as your only sole source of value or currency is really, that's not a cool thing. Like,
well, it's archaic.
Yeah, it's like, it's really old school.
Yeah, it's super, super old school. And so this idea that somebody else needs to be shamed because their concepts of sexuality differ from yours is actually an insult to yourself. It's an insult to say that this person's flooding the market with something that I have decided is one of my primary gifts. It's a gift. However, in a relationship, right? In a relationship between two people, regardless of their gender, sex is a big piece of it, for sure, right? Yeah. It's like a massive piece of that romantic relationship. I'm not going to say that it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. And so is the connection between the two people. And so is their emotional support, and so is their building a life together, and so is their ability to lessen each other's stress and to grow and to live longer because they have somebody to rest into. It's like there's so much more to offer as a human being than sexuality. So this idea of slut shaming is actually a projection. It's a projection of the insecurity that the person who is doing the shaming feels about themselves, that they actually believe that their only real gift to the world or their only commodity is the ability to have sex.
Yeah.
I think this also is why both people in the relationship, though if you're talking about a heterosexual relationship, this is far more likely to happen with women, that they use sex in a manipulative way within the relationship, right? Like they'll only met it out in certain quantities so that the man keeps coming back, but they get to control that aspect of the relationship. Again, we're talking about very archaic, very old programming, right?
Almost creating like a false demand or a false scarcity of sexuality in order to keep him from straying, maybe. Like this idea, like, I don't want to give him too much sex, then he'll get too comfortable and he might get tired of me and leave me or whatever. Mm-hmm. I keep him just on the edge of just enough sex to keep him happy, but yet,
right,
back it off a little bit so he still desires me, kind of idea.
Right, exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. This idea of false scarcity. Absolutely. And what's interesting is that, I mean, like, as a person who's in personal development, as a person who, like, fancies themselves always growing, et cetera, right? Like, I mean, I love personal development, so it's easy to sort of be the equivalent to a bodybuilder in personal development. Just like a bodybuilder goes to the gym every day, I'm doing personal development every day. And what's awesome about that is I really, really, really get to see myself in all my ickiness.
Yeah.
Like, all the shit that I bring, I get to see that in beautiful Technicolor glory. And one of the things that I've realized that I manifest, and I think this is not uncommon for women, is this idea that my husband's going to tire of me, right? Like, he wants variety. He wants to have sex with all these different partners because biologically that's how he's programmed, right? Evolutionary psychology dictates he wants to have sex with as many partners as possible. So why would he ever be interested in me? And, long term. And there is this idea or this, like, maybe this, like, sort of little seeded idea of, like, maybe I should not be giving it away so much, right? Like, maybe I should keep the mystique and intrigue. And a part of me understands why women do that. I get it, right? Because there is a fear around there, around that. And on top of that, I choose not to do that, right? I just make the conscious choice. I make the conscious choice to live in sexual abundance. And one of the reasons why is because it makes me happier, right? Like, increases my quality of life. But then on top of that, if my mates, I'm talking about you as if, you're not here. But I mean,
let's share our sex life with the entire world.
That's okay, right?
We have like several thousand listeners. It's fine. No big deal.
And we're not talking about details. So, unless you want to.
No, I'm good.
Then I'm very transparent.
I'm good. I'll warm up to that idea.
Yeah, but basically what I'm coming down to is, and I'm talking about it as if I'm not talking about you, because this would be the case with any of my, anybody that I would have a pair bond relationship with. The basic idea is that if you choose to leave because you have grown tired of me sexually, there's nothing I can do about that. Right? Like, I can't control that. If you go, you know what? I've just had too much sex with you. I think I'm going to move on. Right? Like, that was going to happen. That was going to happen. And there's really nothing I can do about that.
Yeah.
So why should I make you and I both miserable by manufacturing scarcity when, if you're going to leave anyway, right? Like, let's just enjoy each other in the time being.
Why make ourselves miserable now? Because someday we might be unhappy in the future. Like,
exactly.
At least enjoy the day you're present in.
And the interesting thing is that if I manufactured scarcity, you are actually more likely to leave.
Yeah.
Right? So then it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I've chosen not to go that direction. And there is a part of me that goes, maybe he'll leave because of the choices you make. And then another part of me goes, well, if he chooses to, then that's his choice. And there's nothing I can do about that. I can't really control it. So once again, the solution or answer is, in my opinion, is to be the awesomest person you can be. That's all you can do. All you can do is be awesome.
Yeah.
Right? And this is what we talked about a long time ago. Like, in a situation where you can't control a situation, or in a situation where you can't control all the elements, all you can do is be awesome.
Yeah.
So that's really, I think, kind of the point of all of this, is that we have the ability to sort of give ourselves permission to go beyond our evolutionary programming.
Yeah.
Right? Like, the programming of the past, our social technology, our technology, right? Like, our physical technology. All of these have evolved beyond where our programming is. So the choice is, are we going to stay with old programming that's archaic, that doesn't really have a lot of meaning in the modern world anymore? Or are we going to recognize that we can sort of guide the next phase of evolution? We can guide the next phase of where our brains are going to go and say, look, I'm not going to hold on to old archaic concepts which make me believe that other people need to be shamed because they don't feel the same way that I do.
Yeah.
And my choice is to not. My choice is to say another person opening themselves up sexually or just dressing in a way that appears to be more flirtatious or open sexually, or chooses to pursue birth control when they're not married, or whatever the case is, that those people have a total right to live their life the way they do. And it doesn't mean that they're bringing my stock down, because I've got more to offer.
Yeah.
I've got more to offer than that.
I think I'll just say this kind of, we probably need to wrap it up because it's been going a while, but
sorry.
Go ahead.
And they have more to offer too, and I don't assume that they're not offering all the other stuff as well. Yeah. Like, just because somebody is more open sexually does not mean that they're relying upon that solely themselves either. So I just want to make that point clear.
Absolutely.
That I believe that they and I have risen above this.
Yeah. There's a great, in the United States, we have a great show on our streaming service called Netflix, which there's this great program called House of Cards. And I love the main character, Frank Underwood, in the program House of Cards says, he has this great line, I think it's in season 1. He says, everything is about sex, except for sex. Sex is about power. And I thought that's a great line, and kind of in wrapping this up, because I think a lot of this too, as a man, seeing men and other women freeing themselves sexually, if as a man, I've grappled with this in my life with my own sexuality. The more insecure I feel in my own sexuality, the more it makes me nervous how free other people are in their sexuality. I don't know if this works for women. I can just speak from my perspective as a male.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty basic principle.
But it feels like the more power people have to be free, the more, if I'm insecure, the more powerless I feel. And the more security and the more confidence I've built through the years, and the more I've done work and personal development, and I've owned my own sexuality, the less that bothers me as I go through this journey. And I think that if other people being free sexually bothers you, take an examination of yourself about your feelings and your insecurities. You don't have to share them with anybody, but just really think about, am I insecure in this way? And that's why it's really bothering me. That's why I feel the need to maybe slut shame or look down upon people who are more open in this way. Because as you gain confidence, this doesn't bother you as much from my own experience. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Definitely.
And I don't know if, again, this is a male perspective from my end of things, and I'm guessing that it's the same for women, but I can't speak because I'm not a woman to that. But I'm guessing it's a universal human thing, not just a male thing.
I would say it's a universal thing with all subjects.
Yes.
The more other people are confident and I'm insecure, the more I'm going to see something wrong with their confidence.
Sure.
Because they're a reflection back to me of my insecurity.
Sure.
So I would say that's just a basic principle in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think? We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/personalityhacker. Or you can find us on Twitter. The Twitter handle is personalityhack, HACK. And give us feedback. Let us know what you think about this topic. Ask us questions. What would you like to hear about in the future? And have you been slut-shamed? Have you found yourself slut-shaming other people? I'd be curious to know. I'm sure you would be as well.
This is 2 podcasts that we've gone to a very controversial place.
I like it.
I like it too.
I think it's good.
I like it too. Maybe we'll play a little more safe in the future, or maybe not.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
We're going to go down the road of just storming the gates.
That's right.
Full frontal.
Yeah.
All right. I'm Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You've been listening to the Personality Hacker Podcast. We will talk to you on the next episode. Have a great day.